What if the silence in ancient history is not empty at all but carefully shaped? There is a moment in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia when the voices grow faint, when names once repeated with reverence begin to slip into the margins. The Anunnaki do not fall in battle. They are not mourned. They simply recede. And history, as we inherit it, does not explain why. And before you let your body sink fully into this comfort, take just a very small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I am saying makes you want to stay a little longer. If you wish, share the place and the time where you are listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together tonight. What remains is a gap shaped like memory loss, a disappearance without ruins, a departure without farewell. And the quiet suspicion that what vanished was not only a group of gods, but a way of remembering the world itself. In the earlier Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are everywhere. They are not distant abstractions. They decide borders, assign kingship, weigh destinies, and regulate the balance between heaven, earth, and the underworld. Their presence is administrative, almost bureaucratic, embedded in the daily logic of the cosmos. Yet as centuries pass, their role subtly shifts. They are still named, still acknowledged, but less frequently invoked. Their authority seems diluted, redistributed, as though power itself were being slowly transferred to a different layer of reality. This transition does not announce itself. There is no proclamation carved into stone declaring the end of an age. Instead, the change hides in grammar, in emphasis, in what is no longer said. The later texts speak more often of gods who act on behalf of others, intermediaries who execute rather than decide. The Anunnaki become witnesses instead of actors, symbols instead of agents. And then, in many records, they fade almost entirely, leaving behind only echoes in genealogies and ritual formulas whose meanings are no longer explained. It is tempting to read this as a natural evolution of mythology, the slow reorganization of a pantheon. But the speed of the shift is unsettling. Civilizations usually cling to their highest gods. They rewrite their stories, reinterpret their deeds, but rarely do they allow them to vanish without replacement. Something about this absence feels abrupt, as though a chapter were removed rather than concluded. Archaeology complicates this further. The material culture of Mesopotamia shows remarkable continuity across periods traditionally associated with major mythological transitions. Cities are rebuilt, temples renovated, rituals maintained. Yet the narratives that once justified these structures quietly lose their original anchors. The divine architects recede, while human kings increasingly claim legitimacy through ancestry, conquest, and law rather than direct divine appointment. Authority becomes terrestrial, measurable, administrative. Some scholars point to environmental stress as the underlying force. The late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE were marked by significant climatic fluctuations. Periods of drought disrupted agriculture, weakened city-states, and forced migrations. In such contexts, belief systems often adapt, seeking explanations that restore a sense of order. But adaptation alone does not fully explain erasure. Even catastrophe tends to produce stronger myths, not quieter ones. There is also the matter of chronology. The Sumerian king list famously divides history into two epochs, before and after a great flood. Before it, reigns stretch impossibly long, measured in tens of thousands of years. After it, time collapses into something recognizable, almost modern. The Anunnaki belong overwhelmingly to the first domain, the age of excess duration, when time itself behaves differently. Their disappearance coincides with the normalization of history, the taming of chronology. This raises an uncomfortable question. Did the Anunnaki vanish because the world changed, or did the world change because they were removed from the story? When time becomes shorter, when kings become mortal, when gods stop walking openly among cities, something fundamental has shifted in how reality is framed. Later Mesopotamian cultures inherit the remnants of these stories but handle them carefully. The Anunnaki are no longer emphasized in public ritual. Their names appear in scholarly contexts, in lexical lists, in esoteric traditions preserved by scribes rather than priests. Knowledge about them becomes specialized, restricted, almost archival. It is no longer meant for everyone. This pattern is familiar in human history. When knowledge becomes dangerous, destabilizing, or incompatible with new power structures, it is not always destroyed. More often, it is contained, preserved but out of reach, reframed as symbolic, allegorical, or irrelevant to the present order. Silence becomes a tool more effective than censorship. By the time Mesopotamia falls under the influence of larger empires, the memory of the Anunnaki has already softened. The gods of later periods feel closer to psychological forces than cosmic administrators. They govern emotions, morality, fate, rather than infrastructure and planetary order. The universe has been resized to human scale, and yet traces remain, in the way certain rituals resist explanation, in the way some temples are aligned with celestial cycles no longer referenced in theology, in the persistence of names whose meanings scribes copy faithfully but no longer understand. These are not proofs, they are symptoms. Signs of something that once structured thought but has since been folded into the background. The disappearance of the Anunnaki may not be a single event. It may be a process, stretched across generations, where memory is gradually reclassified. What was once literal becomes metaphor. What was once present becomes ancestral. What was once powerful becomes unspeakable. If that is the case, then asking how the Anunnaki disappeared may already be the wrong question. Perhaps the more unsettling question is who benefited from their absence, or what kind of world becomes possible only after certain stories are allowed to fall silent. And if silence itself can be engineered, shaped slowly over time, then what other absences in history are not accidents, but designs waiting to be noticed? If the Anunnaki truly withdrew, the traces of that withdrawal would not announce themselves as an ending. They would appear instead as a change in tone, a subtle recalibration of who speaks and who is spoken about. In the texts that follow the earlier Sumerian period, something like this begins to happen. The gods remain, but the center of gravity shifts. Authority becomes less vertical, less absolute. The voices that once descended directly from the heavens now arrive filtered, mediated, softened. In the older tablets, divine decisions are final and immediate. Fate is pronounced, cities are assigned, kingship is lowered from the sky as a tangible force. But in later compositions, divine will becomes negotiable. Gods argue among themselves. They send messengers, they delay, they hesitate. The universe feels less governed and more debated, as if the original architects are no longer present to enforce coherence. This transformation is easy to overlook because it unfolds quietly, embedded in literary convention. The names of the Anunnaki do not disappear all at once. They linger in lists and formal invocations in the ceremonial language of oaths, but their actions thin out. They are referenced rather than described, remembered rather than encountered. It is as though they have been moved from the present tense into the past. At the same time, other figures grow more prominent. Gods associated with specific cities, professions, or human concerns rise into the foreground. These deities feel closer, more approachable, less overwhelming. They govern weather, fertility, war, love. They respond to prayers. They can be angered, appeased, persuaded. Power becomes relational rather than absolute. This redistribution of divinity mirrors a parallel change in political structure. Early Mesopotamian kings rule as stewards of divine order, caretakers rather than sovereigns. Their legitimacy flows downward from a cosmic hierarchy. But later rulers increasingly present themselves as strong men, lawgivers, builders, conquerors. They still invoke the gods, but the emphasis is different. The divine becomes a source of endorsement, not command. Such shifts are often explained as natural developments in complex societies. As cities grow, as administration expands, myths adapt to reflect new realities. Yet the precision of the transition invites a deeper look. The Anunnaki do not evolve into other gods. They step aside, and no one takes their place at the top. The absence at the summit creates an interesting vacuum. Without supreme cosmic administrators, the universe becomes less structured, more ambiguous. Fate is no longer fixed at birth. The future becomes something to negotiate, to influence through ritual, prayer, and ethical behaviour. This is a more human-centred cosmos, one that lines well with societies where human agency is becoming increasingly important. But this raises a quiet tension. If the Anunnaki once embodied a level of order beyond human comprehension, what happens when that order is removed? Does the world become freer or more fragile? The texts do not answer directly. They simply proceed as if the question itself is no longer relevant. Linguistic evidence reinforces this impression. Certain titles associated with the Anunnaki stop appearing in active contexts. Words that once implied direct governance are replaced with terms suggesting oversight or legacy. Even the grammar shifts. Verbs associated with decisive action give way to verbs of remembrance and tradition. The language does not accuse. It does not explain. It adapts. In scribal schools, where knowledge was transmitted across generations, the treatment of these older concepts becomes increasingly technical. The Anunnaki appear in lexical lists, categorized alongside rare words and archaic expressions. They are studied, not worshipped, preserved, not invoked. This is the language of curation rather than devotion. Such preservation is significant. It suggests that the memory of the Anunnaki was not lost accidentally. It was intentionally maintained, but within controlled boundaries. To know of them became a mark of education, not belief. Their stories were no longer meant to shape behaviour, only to be understood as part of a distant past. This pattern appears again and again in human history. When a worldview becomes incompatible with the present, it is often not destroyed but reclassified. It moves from myth to literature, from ritual to archive. It remains visible but powerless. Its influence becomes indirect, subtle, almost aesthetic. The result is a layered historical consciousness. On the surface, a coherent narrative of progress and continuity. Beneath it, older frameworks quietly fossilized, still legible to those who know how to read them. The disappearance of the Anunnaki may belong to this deeper stratum, where change is enacted not through rupture, but through recontextualization. There is also the question of discomfort. The Anunnaki are not benevolent in the simple sense. They judge, impose, calculate. They operate on scales that dwarf individual lives. In a world increasingly focused on human concerns, such figures may have felt oppressive, incompatible with emerging ethical systems centered on personal responsibility and social law. By allowing these gods to recede, cultures may have been reshaping not only their theology, but their sense of self. A cosmos governed by distant administrators leaves little room for human meaning. A cosmos governed by negotiable forces allows for hope, guilt, ambition, and reform. Yet something is lost in the exchange. The earlier worldview, however alien, implies a universe with an underlying structure that does not depend on belief. Order exists whether humans acknowledge it or not. In the later worldview, order becomes contingent, fragile, maintained through ritual and moral effort. The burden shifts. If the Anunnaki vanished at the moment when history became human-centered, then their disappearance may mark not an end but a turning inward, a decision, conscious or not, to prioritize narratives that place humanity at the center of meaning. But decisions leave residues. They show up as inconsistencies, as unresolved symbols, as questions that never quite go away. And in the margins of Mesopotamian history, there are still whispers of an earlier arrangement, one in which power did not answer to prayer and memory was not shaped for comfort. What if the fading of the Anunnaki was not simply a mythological adjustment, but a response to something that could no longer be accommodated? And what kinds of knowledge become unspeakable when a culture decides that the universe must finally make sense to human minds? When historians attempt to reconstruct the deep past of Mesopotamia, they often rely on sequences, lists of kings, lines of succession, years counted and recounted. These tools create the impression of continuity, of a world unfolding in orderly progression. Yet within these sequences there is a fracture that resists smoothing, a place where numbers lose proportion and time itself seems to behave differently. The Sumerian king list is not a neutral document. It is an artifact shaped by ideology, memory, and the need to explain legitimacy. It opens with a world before normal history, when kingship descends from the heavens and rulers reign not for decades but for thousands of years. These reigns stretch beyond the human scale, defying biological plausibility and common sense. And presiding over this age of excess duration are the Anunnaki, either explicitly or by implication, as the authorities who sanction such impossible continuity. Then comes the flood. Not described in detail here, not dramatized, but stated almost clinically, a dividing line. After it the numbers collapse, rains shrink, time accelerates, history, as we recognize it, begins. This compression of time is often dismissed as mythic exaggeration giving way to realism, but the sharpness of the transition is unsettling. There is no gradual tapering, no intermediate phase where lifespans shorten incrementally. One moment, rulers endure for tens of thousands of years. The next, they rule for decades. The shift is absolute. What kind of event demands such narrative recalibration? Natural disasters can devastate populations, but they do not rewrite the logic of time itself. Even cultural collapse rarely produces such clean chronological breaks. Something more conceptual appears to be at work, a decision about what counts as history. The pre-flood rulers belong to a different category of being. They are not ancestors in the usual sense. They function more like placeholders for an order that no longer applies. Their exaggerated reigns may encode not literal years, but a perception of timeless governance, a period when authority was not measured against human limits. The Anunnaki inhabit this same temporal ambiguity. They are associated with cycles rather than events, with structures rather than stories. When the king list transitions into the post-flood era, it does more than reset the calendar. It reframes reality. The world becomes one where power must be justified within human time. This reframing has consequences. Once history is compressed, it becomes manageable. It can be recorded, debated, revised. Long reigns invite questions about divinity. Short reigns invite questions about competence. The focus shifts from cosmic order to political performance. The absence of the Anunnaki from this new temporal regime is striking. They are not listed among post-flood rulers. They do not oversee the transition. They vanish precisely when time becomes accountable. It is as if their presence requires a different scale, one incompatible with the emerging logic of record-keeping. Some have suggested that the long reigns are symbolic, representing dynasties rather than individuals, or astronomical cycles encoded as kings. These interpretations attempt to reconcile the text with modern sensibilities. But even if symbolic, the symbolism still points to a worldview where time flows differently, a worldview that is abandoned, not evolved. The flood in this context functions less as a physical event and more as a narrative device, a reset, a justification for forgetting. It allows the scribes to draw a line and say before this the rules were different. After this we begin again, and with that beginning comes omission. The Anunnaki are not denied. They are simply no longer necessary. Their role belonged to a world that no longer exists, or is no longer allowed to exist within the story. This kind of temporal surgery is not unique to Mesopotamia. Other cultures also divide time into mythical and historical ages, often using catastrophe as the hinge. What is unusual here is the precision with which certain figures are excluded from the post-catastrophe narrative. The Anunnaki do not reappear in diminished form. They are not reborn as heroes or ancestors. They are sealed into the prehistory. This sealing has the effect of containment. Whatever they represent is confined to a realm that cannot challenge the present. If questioned, their stories can be dismissed as belonging to a time before proper history, before reliable records, before reasoned. Yet the traces remain embedded in the structure of the list itself. The very act of acknowledging a pre-flood era preserves the memory of a world that does not conform to later norms. It is a compromise between erasure and honesty. The scribes could not fully eliminate the past, but they could quarantine it. This quarantine raises an unsettling possibility. What if the disappearance of the Anunnaki is not about their destruction or departure, but about a shift in what humanity is willing to acknowledge? What if they represent a model of reality that became incompatible with emerging social systems? As cities grew and power centralized, history became a tool. Chronology was no longer just a way to remember. It was a way to legitimize. Short reigns allowed for clearer lines of succession. Manageable timelines supported claims of divine favor and lawful inheritance. Infinite time undermines authority. It suggests a standard beyond human reach. By compressing time, cultures compress accountability. They bring the gods closer, make them speak in familiar terms. They remove figures who operate outside negotiation. The Anunnaki, with their association to cosmic administration and vast temporal scales, may have been casualties of this necessity. The silence that follows their disappearance is not empty. It is structured by numbers, by lists, by carefully calibrated chronology. It is the silence of a past that has been redefined as irrelevant, even if it still haunts the margins. If the king list teaches anything, it is that history is not merely recorded, it is edited, and in the editing certain forms of memory become untenable. The question that lingers is whether those memories were discarded because they were false, or because they were too disruptive to retain, and if time itself can be reshaped to support a new order, what other dimensions of reality might have been adjusted along the way, quietly, without leaving behind anything but a sudden, impossible change in scale? If the disappearance of the Anunnaki coincides with a compression of time, it also overlaps with a period when the Earth itself appears to falter. Long before modern instruments, ancient observers recorded the land as unstable, unreliable, capable of sudden withdrawal. Rivers shifted their courses, fields turned to dust. Cities were abandoned not because they were conquered, but because they could no longer be sustained. In the layers of Mesopotamian soil, archaeologists have identified horizons of disruption. Thick bands of sediment suggesting prolonged drought, episodes of flooding, or both occurring in uneasy sequence. These were not isolated disasters. They stretched across regions, affecting multiple city-states simultaneously. Agriculture, the fragile foundation of early civilization, would have suffered first. Surplus would have vanished. Trade would have slowed. Social order would have thinned. In such conditions, the presence of distant cosmic administrators becomes difficult to reconcile with lived experience. When the land fails repeatedly, when rituals no longer guarantee stability, belief systems are forced to adapt. But adaptation does not always mean reinterpretation. Sometimes it means withdrawal, silence, the quiet removal of expectations that can no longer be met. The Anunnaki, as they appear in early texts, are not weather gods in the simple sense. They do not bring rain or withhold it on a whim. They regulate systems. They oversee balances too large for daily negotiation. Their authority implies predictability, order, continuity across generations. Environmental collapse undermines this implication at its core. If the world no longer behaves as expected, then the entities responsible for maintaining that behavior become problematic. Either they have failed, or they have left. Both possibilities destabilize the cosmology, and so the safest response may not be accusation, but distance. A gradual softening of their presence until they no longer demand explanation. This does not require conscious deception. Cultures often respond to trauma by narrowing their focus. When survival becomes immediate, metaphysical speculation recedes. Gods become local. Concerns become practical. The universe shrinks to the scale of what can still be influenced. The archaeological record supports this inward turn. During periods of environmental stress, monumental construction slows. Temples are repaired rather than expanded. Inscriptions emphasize piety, obedience, humility. The language of cosmic mastery fades, replaced by appeals for mercy and protection. The tone is different, less confident, more anxious. This tonal shift echoes the textual changes surrounding the Anunnaki. Where once they were named as arbiters of destiny, they now appear as distant figures, invoked more for legitimacy than intervention. Their role becomes ceremonial, symbolic, a memory of stability rather than a guarantee of it. Some researchers have proposed that these environmental events were severe enough to cause population bottlenecks, mass migrations, and the collapse of entire administrative systems. If true, then the continuity implied by early cosmology would have been visibly broken. The world would no longer resemble the one described in foundational myths. In such moments, myths are not simply rewritten, they are triaged. Elements that no longer resonate are set aside. Others are emphasized to restore coherence. Gods who promise order are replaced by gods who explain suffering. The Anunnaki, associated with an earlier, more stable world, may have belonged to a narrative that could no longer be sustained. There is also the matter of scale. Environmental crises force attention downward, towards soil, water, and immediate survival. Cosmic cycles lose relevance when crops fail. Long-term governance gives way to short-term adaptation. A pantheon structured around planetary order becomes less meaningful than one concerned with storms, fertility, and protection. This practical shift would not require the denial of the Anunnaki's existence, only their relevance. They could remain acknowledged, even revered while no longer consulted. Their silence would mirror the silence of the heavens during prolonged hardship. Yet the texts do not frame this as abandonment. There are no laments accusing the Anunnaki of neglect. Instead, there is a careful avoidance of the question altogether. The narrative simply moves on. This restraint is telling. It suggests discomfort rather than resolution. If environmental disruption contributed to the fading of the Anunnaki, it would explain the lack of closure. Natural forces do not negotiate. They do not explain themselves. They simply alter conditions until old frameworks no longer apply. The disappearance of certain gods may reflect this same impersonal pressure, but this explanation is incomplete on its own. Environmental stress can destabilize belief, but it does not usually erase it so cleanly. Often, it intensifies devotion. It radicalizes faith. The absence of overt religious upheaval suggests that something else was at play alongside ecological change. Perhaps the environmental crises did not cause the disappearance of the Anunnaki, but provided the conditions under which their disappearance became acceptable, a justification rather than a reason, a background against which deeper transformations could unfold without resistance. In this reading, the land's instability becomes a metaphor for a larger uncertainty. When the ground itself can no longer be trusted, neither can the old stories that described it as ordered. New narratives must emerge, ones that reflect fragility rather than permanence. The Anunnaki, tied to an age of cosmic assurance, would have felt out of place in such a world. Their withdrawal may mark the end of a particular relationship between humanity and certainty itself, a recognition that order is no longer guaranteed, but must be continuously negotiated. And yet, even in this negotiation, traces of the old order persist, in the alignment of cities to stars whose significance is no longer explained, in ritual calendars that track cycles no longer named. in the sense that something vast once governed the world, and that its absence is still felt, even if no one speaks of it directly. Environmental change reshapes landscapes, but it also reshapes memory. It forces cultures to decide which parts of the past remain useful and which become burdens. The silence surrounding the Anunnaki may be one such decision, made gradually, under pressure, without ever being formally declared. If so, then their disappearance is not only about gods and myths, it is about how civilizations respond when the world no longer behaves as promised, about what is remembered and what is quietly allowed to fade when stability itself becomes uncertain. And if ancient landscapes could erase certain forms of order without leaving clear explanations, what other silences in history might reflect not ignorance, but adaptation to conditions that no longer allowed certain truths to be spoken aloud? Flood narratives linger in human memory like half-remembered dreams. They appear across cultures, separated by geography, yet bound by a shared intuition that the world once ended and began again. In Mesopotamia, the flood is not merely a story of destruction. It is a hinge in time, a moment when continuity is broken and then carefully reassembled. What is striking is not that a flood is remembered, but how it is remembered. The texts do not dwell on chaos. They do not linger on panic or suffering. Instead, the flood is treated almost as a technical interruption, a necessary reset, a cleansing that allows history to resume on new terms, and within this reset something quietly disappears. Before the flood, the Anunnaki occupy a position of unquestioned authority. They convene councils, they determine destinies, they regulate the deep architecture of the cosmos. After the flood, their presence becomes ambiguous. They are no longer central actors. They do not guide reconstruction. They do not preside over renewal. The world continues, but under different management. In the Epic of Atrahasis, and later in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is framed as a response to imbalance. Humanity has grown too numerous, too loud, too disruptive. The gods react, yet even here, the Anunnaki are curiously restrained. Decisions are fragmented among divine figures, debated, delayed. Authority feels dispersed, uncertain. The decisive unity implied in earlier traditions is gone. After the waters recede, the relationship between gods and humans is renegotiated. Mortality is reinforced, lifespans are shortened, suffering becomes normalized. The world is no longer designed for endurance, but for turnover. This is not presented as punishment alone, it is presented as adjustment. In this adjusted world, the Anunnaki no longer fit comfortably. Their association with long cycles, vast durations, and structural order belongs to a pre-flood logic. A world that tolerated extremes. A world that operated beyond human rhythm. The flood marks the end of that tolerance. It is tempting to see the flood as purely symbolic, a mythic way of explaining environmental catastrophe. But its narrative function is more precise. It allows for discontinuity without blame. The old world is gone, not because it was wrong, but because it is no longer viable. This distinction matters. It preserves dignity while permitting erasure. Within this framework, the disappearance of the Anunnaki becomes almost procedural. They are not defeated. They are not condemned. They simply belong to a system that has been retired. Their absence is explained not through conflict, but through obsolescence. This kind of narrative strategy is powerful. It allows cultures to move forward without confronting uncomfortable questions. If the world has been reset, then inconsistencies can be attributed to before times. Lost knowledge becomes irrelevant. Unanswered questions become artifacts of a previous iteration. The flood thus functions as a boundary beyond which inquiry is discouraged. What came before is acknowledged, but not explored. It is sealed behind water, myth, and exaggerated time. The Anunnaki, bound to that sealed world, remain present only as shadows. There is also a psychological dimension to this sealing. Floods erase landmarks, they flatten terrain, they dissolve borders. After such an event, rebuilding requires simplification. Complexity becomes a liability. Narratives must be streamlined to restore coherence. The removal of a complex, multi-layered divine administration could be part of this simplification. A smaller, more approachable pantheon is easier to navigate in times of recovery. Gods who respond to prayer are more comforting than gods who regulate destiny from a distance. Yet the texts do not fully let go. The Anunnaki are still named in ritual contexts related to the underworld and judgment. They remain associated with deep time, with the dead, with boundaries beyond the living world. This repositioning is subtle, but significant. They move from governors of life to custodians of what lies beneath it. This shift reframes them not as absent, but as removed from the visible order. They do not vanish upward or outward, but downward into realms that are acknowledged yet inaccessible. Their silence becomes spatial rather than absolute. Such a move preserves continuity while enforcing distance. The Anunnaki still exist, but they no longer interfere. They are beyond appeal, beyond negotiation. This makes them safe. A power that cannot be invoked cannot destabilize the present. From this perspective, the flood is less about water than about boundaries. It redraws the map of reality. Certain beings remain on one side. Humanity remains on the other. Interaction is minimized. Over time, this separation hardens. Later generations inherit a world where the Anunnaki are part of cosmology, not history. They explain death, judgment, and the distant past, but not current affairs. Their disappearance from daily life becomes normalized. What is lost in this process is not only a group of gods, but a way of understanding continuity. The idea that the same forces govern all eras gives way to the idea that epochs are fundamentally different, that what applied once may never apply again. This has profound implications. It suggests that knowledge itself can expire, that certain truths are only valid under specific conditions. The Anunnaki, tied to a pre-flood order, become truths that no longer function, and yet, expired truths have a way of lingering. They surface in anomalies, in symbols that resist reinterpretation, in the feeling that something foundational has been deliberately set aside. The flood, remembered as cleansing, may also be remembered as concealment. Water hides as effectively as it destroys. What lies beneath it is preserved, but inaccessible. The Anunnaki, associated with this submerged past, become part of what cannot be reached without crossing forbidden thresholds. If their disappearance is bound to this act of concealment, then it is not an accident of myth, but a feature of memory management, a way to ensure that certain questions remain unanswered, not because they lack answers, but because their answers belong to a world no longer meant to be recovered. And if the flood marks the moment when humanity agreed, consciously or not, to let certain frameworks sink beyond recall, then the silence surrounding the Anunnaki is maybe less about loss and more about a boundary we have inherited without ever choosing. What remains uncertain is whether that boundary was drawn for protection or for control, and whether the things left beneath it are truly gone, or merely waiting in a depth that history has taught itself not to explore. After the flood, the architecture of power changes. This shift is not only visible in texts, but in stone, in space, in the way cities are organized and authority is performed. Where once temples seemed to function as meeting points between cosmic administrators and the human world, they begin to transform into instruments of mediation. The gods no longer rule directly, they are represented. In early Mesopotamian imagination, the boundary between divine and human authority is porous. Kingship descends from the heavens. Rulers are appointed, not elected, not conquered into place. They serve as conduits rather than sources of power. The Anunnaki stand behind them, unseen but decisive. The king governs because the universe is already decided. But in the periods that follow the Great Reset, something subtle yet decisive occurs. Kings remain sacred, but their role changes. They become lawgivers, judges, builders of canals and walls. Their legitimacy is still couched in divine language, yet the emphasis has shifted. Power is exercised downward rather than received from above. This transition is reflected in inscriptions. Early rulers speak of obedience, later rulers speak of achievement. Where the past is invoked, it is no longer as a living authority but as precedent. The gods are witnesses to human action, not the authors of it. The priesthood expands alongside this change. As divine presence becomes less immediate, interpretation grows more important. Ritual specialists, scribes, and temple administrators step into the space left by absent cosmic governors. They do not claim divinity, but they claim access. Knowledge becomes a form of power. In this new configuration, the Anunnaki pose a problem. Their authority bypasses mediation. They do not require interpretation. They act. Such figures are incompatible with a system that depends on controlled access to the sacred. To maintain order, divine distance becomes necessary, and so the Anunnaki are repositioned. They are no longer central to governance. They are moved into cosmological background roles. They become ancestral forces, judges of the dead, custodians of realms beyond daily reach. Their presence is acknowledged, but their influence is neutralized. This is not suppression in the crude sense. It is restructuring, a redistribution of roles that preserves continuity while altering function. The Anunnaki remain part of the story, but no longer part of the system. The rise of codified law reinforces this shift. Legal texts from the early 2nd millennium BCE present justice as something administered by kings under divine sanction. The gods authorize law, but they do not enforce it directly. Responsibility is localized. Human institutions become the visible machinery of order. This localization requires a certain theological clarity. Gods must be legible, predictable, responsive. The Anunnaki, associated with vast cycles and opaque decisions, do not fit easily into this framework. Their silence becomes liability. By contrast, gods who can be petitioned, appeased, and angered serve the new order well. They provide a moral economy. They reward obedience and punish transgression in ways that reinforce social norms. The Anunnaki do not moralize, they regulate. Regulation without moral explanation is unsettling. It suggests a universe governed by rules rather than intentions. Such a worldview leaves little room for repentance or negotiation. It implies that outcomes are structural, not personal. For societies seeking stability through law and ritual, this implication is difficult to accommodate. As a result, the cosmic dimension of authority is gradually narrowed. The universe becomes ethical rather than mechanical. Cause and effect are framed in terms of behavior rather than balance. This ethical framing aligns more closely with human governance. The disappearance of the Anunnaki from active roles may thus reflect a deeper realignment, a movement away from an impersonal cosmos toward a relational one, a world where power listens, reacts, and can be influenced. Yet traces of the earlier structure remain embedded in ritual language and architectural design. Certain temples retain orientations that no longer correspond to active deities. Certain ceremonies reference authorities whose names are spoken but not explained. These are remnants of an older system, preserved out of tradition rather than understanding. The scribes who copied these formulas may not have known their original significance, but they recognized their weight. To remove them entirely would have risked destabilizing the inherited order, so they were kept, even as their context dissolved. This creates a layered religious experience. On the surface, a functional pantheon aligned with daily life. Beneath it, a deeper stratum of symbols pointing to a time when governance was conceived differently. The Anunnaki occupy this deeper layer, present but unreachable. Such layering allows cultures to evolve without rupture. It enables continuity without fidelity. The past is honoured, but not obeyed. remembered but not consulted. If the Anunnaki disappeared during this transformation, it may be because they represented a form of authority incompatible with the emerging structures of power. Not because they were disproven, but because they could not be integrated. This raises an unsettling possibility. What if the disappearance of the Anunnaki marks the moment when humanity chose governance over truth? When systems that worked replaced systems that explained? When order was prioritized over comprehension? The shift from cosmic administration to human mediation creates stability, but it also narrows perspective. The universe becomes smaller, more familiar, less strange. Mystery is managed rather than confronted, and yet the persistence of the Anunnaki in marginal roles suggests that something was never fully resolved. Their relegation to the underworld, to judgment, to deep time, implies unfinished business. They are not gone, they are waiting. Waiting in texts that are copied but not read closely, in symbols that are repeated without interpretation, in structures whose original purpose has been forgotten, but whose presence still shapes behaviour. If power was restructured to accommodate a new world, then the silence of the Anunnaki may reflect not their absence, but a decision to stop listening, a choice to build a reality that functions without requiring answers to questions that destabilize it. And if that choice was made once, under pressure, it may have been repeated many times since. Each repetition pushing certain forms of knowledge further into the background, until they feel ancient, irrelevant, or unreal. The disappearance of the Anunnaki, seen through this lens, becomes less a mystery of mythology, and more a mirror held up to civilization itself. A reminder that what vanishes from the centre often does so not because it is false, but because it asks too much of the structures we depend on to survive. What remains uncertain is whether those structures can endure indefinitely without the deeper orders they once quietly replaced, and whether the silence we have inherited is a sign of progress, or a warning encoded so deeply that it can only be felt, never spoken aloud. When a civilization decides to forget something, it rarely does so by erasing words. More often it changes how those words are used. Meaning shifts first. Sound remains. Language becomes a vessel carrying contents no longer examined. This is where the disappearance of the Anunnaki becomes especially subtle, because it unfolds not through silence alone, but through vocabulary that continues to exist while slowly hollowing out. In the earliest layers of Sumerian language, names associated with the Anunnaki are embedded in verbs of action. They decide, they measure, they assign, they decree. These are not poetic gestures. They are functional terms, the language of administration. The cosmos as described here is not a mystery but a managed system. Later texts retain many of the same names, but the verbs change. The Anunnaki are no longer described as acting upon the world. They are remembered, honoured, listed. Their presence becomes grammatical rather than causal. They occupy nouns, not sentences. This linguistic shift is easy to miss because it does not feel dramatic. But language is where reality is negotiated. When a figure no longer appears as a subject of action, its authority has already diminished, regardless of how often its name is spoken. Even more revealing is what disappears entirely. Certain technical terms associated with cosmic measurement, balance, and deep order stop being used outside of scholarly contexts. They survive in lexical lists preserved by scribes as part of an educational canon, but they no longer appear in prayers or public inscriptions. They're no longer functional language, they're artifacts. Lexical lists are not neutral documents, they're curated memory. To include a word in such a list is to acknowledge its past importance while admitting its present irrelevance. The Anunnaki, increasingly confined to these lists, undergo the same transition. They become something to be known about, not something to be addressed. This transformation suggests intentional containment. Knowledge is not lost, it is archived, and archiving creates distance. What is archived no longer participates in daily life. It becomes safe. There is also the matter of euphemism. In later periods, certain functions once attributed to the Anunnaki are reassigned without explanation. Judgment becomes abstract. Fate becomes impersonal. Balance becomes moral rather than structural. The underlying concepts remain, but their origins are obscured. This obscuring protects continuity while allowing reinterpretation. People continue to live within a structured universe, but the structure is explained differently. The original architects are no longer required. Linguistic anthropology shows that when power shifts, language adapts to legitimize that shift. Words associated with former authority often survive in diluted form, stripped of their original force. This is not deception, it is accommodation. The Anunnaki appear to have undergone precisely this process. Their names persist, but their operational meaning dissolves. Over generations, this dissolution becomes normalized. No one notices what has been lost because the words are still there. Another sign of this process is the disappearance of direct questions. Early texts ask why things happen in terms of cosmic order. Later texts ask how to respond. The frame changes from explanation to coping. Language follows suit. The grammar of inevitability gives way to the grammar of responsibility. Humans become accountable not to cosmic systems, but to moral expectations. This moralization of language supports legal systems, social hierarchies, and centralized authority. It also marginalizes entities that operate outside moral negotiation. The Anunnaki, as figures tied to structural balance rather than ethical judgment, become linguistically awkward. They do not punish or forgive, they calibrate. Such calibration resists moral storytelling. It cannot be easily absorbed into narratives that prioritize intention and guilt. As a result, their names drift toward contexts where moral ambiguity is acceptable: the underworld, ancestral memory, the distant past. Language relocates them without announcing the move. There is also a phonetic dimension to consider. Certain names associated with the Anunnaki are preserved because they carry weight, rhythm, authority. Sound can outlive meaning. Ritual language often retains archaic forms long after their semantic clarity is gone. Chanting replaces understanding. This phenomenon creates a strange continuity. People speak names that once commanded reality, without knowing what those names originally did. Power becomes aesthetic. Mystery becomes decorative. From the outside, it appears as preservation. From within, it is forgetting disguised as reverence. This process does not require a conspiracy. It unfolds naturally in systems that value stability. When older frameworks threaten coherence, they are softened. Language becomes the buffer. Over time, even scholars inherit this softened language. They study the Anunnaki as mythological figures, not as functional components of an ancient worldview. The shift is complete. The past has been translated into something safe, yet translation always involves loss. Concepts that have no equivalent are either simplified or ignored. The Anunnaki may represent such a concept: governance without morality, order without empathy, structure without negotiation. A difficult idea to carry forward. If language could no longer support that idea, then its disappearance was inevitable. Not because it was false, but because it could not be expressed within the new linguistic economy. And this raises a deeper question. How many other concepts have vanished not because evidence was lacking, but because language evolved in ways that could no longer hold them? When words change, reality changes with them. The disappearance of the Anunnaki may therefore be less about gods leaving, and more about language losing the capacity to describe a certain kind of order. If that capacity was lost once, under pressure from social transformation, it may have been lost again and again in other contexts, each time narrowing the range of what can be thought, not through force, but through vocabulary. The silence surrounding the Anunnaki is thus not empty. It is full of words that no longer mean what they once did, full of names that still echo but no longer point. And if silence can be constructed through language itself, then listening for what has vanished requires more than reading texts. It requires attending to grammar, to usage, to what no longer appears as a subject capable of acting. In that absence, something remains unsettled, a sense that the world was once described differently, governed differently, understood through structures that no longer fit our sentences. What we inherit is not a clean break, but a linguistic shadow, a reminder that forgetting does not always look like loss. Sometimes it looks like fluency. There are moments in the ancient record when attention turns upward, away from Earth and toward the slow, indifferent motions of the sky. Not in wonder, but in calculation. The stars are not admired, they are tracked, counted, their returns anticipated with a precision that suggests obligation rather than curiosity. In early Mesopotamian astronomy, celestial observation is not a separate science. It is embedded in governance, ritual timing, and the regulation of fate. The heavens are not metaphors, they are mechanisms. And within this framework, the Anunnaki are never far away, even when they are not named. Certain tablets describe cycles that stretch far beyond human lifespans. Long returns, rare alignments, periods so vast they cannot be experienced, only inherited. These cycles do not function as omens in the usual sense. They function as schedules. The universe appears to run on a timetable indifferent to immediate human concern. Later traditions preserve the calculations but alter their significance. The same celestial movements are reinterpreted as signs rather than structures. Astrology replaces astronomy. Meaning replaces mechanism. The sky begins to speak rather than operate. This shift is subtle but decisive. A sky that operates requires administrators. A sky that speaks requires interpreters. The Anunnaki belong to the first model. They regulate. They oversee. They maintain balance between forces too large to moralize. When the sky becomes expressive rather than mechanical, those administrators are no longer necessary. Meaning can be negotiated, signs can be debated. Authority moves from the cosmos to the reader of the cosmos. Some tablets hint at this transition without explaining it. Astronomical records become more elaborate just as the theological role of cosmic governors fades. It is as if observation intensifies precisely when explanation is withdrawn. This raises an unsettling possibility. What if the Anunnaki did not disappear at the moment when celestial knowledge was lost, but at the moment when it became too precise to remain mythological? When patterns once attributed to divine will were recognized as regular, repeatable and indifferent? A universe governed by cycles does not require gods who decide. It requires systems that persist. The Anunnaki, if understood as custodians of such systems, may have become redundant once those systems could be described without invoking agency. But redundancy is not disappearance. Knowledge can be retained without its original frame. The danger lies in what happens next. As celestial cycles are reinterpreted, their implications change. A predictable sky invites prediction, not submission. It allows for planning, for anticipation, for a sense of control. This sense aligns well with emerging political structures that value foresight and strategy, yet it undermines older forms of authority that rely on mystery and inevitability. If the heavens move according to knowable rules, then destiny becomes something to calculate rather than accept. The Anunnaki, associated with inevitability, lose their narrative function. There is also the matter of long cycles that resist integration. Certain astronomical periods are so vast that they exceed cultural memory. They cannot be lived, only transmitted. Their meaning depends on trust across generations. If that trust erodes, the cycles become inert data, numbers without context. The Anunnaki may have been the guarantors of that trust, the figures who ensured continuity across spans no human could witness. Without them, long cycles lose coherence. They remain recorded, but their purpose becomes obscure. Why track something that will not return for millennia? Why remember what cannot be confirmed? The answer may lie in obligation. The recording persists not because it is understood, but because it has always been done. Tradition replaces comprehension. The act becomes ritualized. This ritualization of astronomy mirrors the ritualization of divine names. Both preserve form while abandoning function. The Anunnaki linger in this space, implied but inactive. Some have speculated that certain celestial records hint at a departure rather than an absence, that cycles were marked not to predict return but to note an ending, a final alignment, a closing window. Such interpretations remain speculative, but they resonate with the broader pattern. The heavens are tracked intensely, then reinterpreted. Cosmic administrators recede just as cosmic regularity becomes undeniable. If the Anunnaki were once understood as stewards of a dynamic, living cosmos, their disappearance may coincide with the recognition that the cosmos does not respond. It persists, indifferent. This recognition is not comforting. It removes dialogue from the universe. It replaces relationship with structure. The gods who remain are those who can still interact on a human scale. The sky, meanwhile, becomes background, a source of signs rather than decisions. Its vast cycles continue, but without narrative closure. There is a quiet grief in this transformation, a sense that something once mediated between human time and cosmic time, and that mediation has been withdrawn. The Anunnaki may represent that lost bridge. If so, then their disappearance is not about leaving the Earth, but about leaving relevance. The cosmos remains vast, but no longer speaks in the language of governance. And yet, the records persist. Tablets copied and recopied, preserving numbers whose significance has thinned. They are like messages addressed to a future that may no longer know how to read them. The silence of the Anunnaki within these records is not empty. It is the silence of a system that continues to operate without acknowledging its former custodians. If the sky once required stewards, and no longer does, then the question becomes not where the Anunnaki went, but what changed in our understanding of order itself. And if our understanding changed once, under the pressure of observation and calculation, it may change again. Each change pushing certain figures further into abstraction, until they survive only as names attached to rhythms we no longer feel. The disappearance of the Anunnaki, seen through the lens of the sky, becomes a story about scale, about the moment when the universe grew too vast, too regular, too indifferent to require intermediaries. What remains is a sky that moves on schedule, and a history that learned to look at it without expecting an answer. There is a recurring pattern in human history that rarely announces itself as change. It feels instead like recovery. After disruption, after collapse, after loss, societies do not simply rebuild what was there before. They simplify, they select, they begin again with fewer assumptions, fewer layers, fewer truths that require maintenance. This is sometimes described as renewal, sometimes as progress. But beneath those names lies a quieter mechanism, the resetting of narrative complexity. In the Mesopotamian record, the world after the flood is not merely smaller in population, it is smaller in memory. The past becomes segmented. Certain forms of a knowledge are no longer expected to survive intact. They are allowed to blur, to fragment, to retreat into abstraction. The Anunnaki appear to recede along with this contraction, not because they are disproven, but because they belong to a world that requires more memory than the new order can sustain. A civilization that is rebuilding cannot carry everything forward. Choices must be made, even if they are never articulated. What is essential? What is stabilizing? What threatens coherence? These decisions do not always happen consciously, but they are reflected in what is taught, repeated, and ritually reinforced. The Anunnaki, associated with deep time, cosmic administration, and structures beyond human agency, may have represented an unnecessary burden. Their worldview does not offer guidance for rebuilding cities or managing crops. It offers explanation at a scale too large to be useful in recovery. In contrast, gods who oversee fertility, protection, justice, and kingship are immediately relevant. They help organize society. They give meaning to effort. They support authority. A reset favors such figures. This does not require hostility toward older frameworks, only indifference. Knowledge that cannot be operationalized becomes background. Eventually it becomes myth. Some scholars describe this process as a form of civilizational reboot. After systemic shock, societies restart with a narrowed scope of assumptions. They retain what works and archive what does not. The archive is not destroyed, but it is no longer active. The Anunnaki may occupy precisely this archived position. Their presence remains acknowledged but inert. They are no longer part of the living system. This interpretation reframes disappearance as dormancy, a knowledge structure put to sleep rather than erased. And sleep, unlike death, implies the possibility of return, though not without consequence. There are signs of this dormancy scattered throughout the later record. References that feel out of place, concepts that are preserved without explanation, rituals whose original rationale is no longer articulated. These are not mistakes. They are residues of a previous configuration. In systems theory, resets often involve the pruning of feedback loops that are too complex to manage. The Anunnaki, as regulators of a vast and impersonal cosmos, represent such a loop. Their removal simplifies the system, but at the cost of depth. This simplification produces stability, but also fragility. When a system is built on fewer assumptions, it has less capacity to absorb shock. It becomes efficient, but brittle. The post-reset world of Mesopotamia reflects this tension. Law becomes codified, authority becomes centralized, religion becomes moralized. These are powerful stabilizers, but they rely on constant maintenance. Without cosmic redundancy, order must be continuously enforced. The earlier worldview implied that order existed regardless of human action. The later worldview implies that order depends on obedience, ritual, and enforcement. Responsibility shifts entirely onto society. The disappearance of the Anunnaki may mark the moment when humanity accepted that burden, when the universe ceased to be self-regulating and became something that had to be managed through institutions. This acceptance would not feel like loss at first. It would feel empowering. Human action would matter more. Choices would have consequences. Meaning would be closer at hand. Only later would the cost become apparent. The loss of a framework that situates humanity within a larger and different order leaves cultures vulnerable to believing that their systems are final, complete, unquestionable. Without the Anunnaki, there is no reminder that authority can exist beyond moral narrative. That order can persist without justification. Everything becomes subject to interpretation, negotiation, revision. This is not inherently negative. It allows for growth, reform, empathy. But it also allows for manipulation. When all authority is mediated, those who control mediation control reality. The silence around the Anunnaki may therefore signal the emergence of a new kind of power, one that does not rule from the heavens, but from institutions, from texts, from interpretation itself. If the reset was successful, then memory would gradually align with the new order. What once felt like a mission would come to feel natural. The archived past would lose emotional weight, and yet certain questions would persist. Why do early texts describe a world so different from the one that followed? Why do some symbols resist reinterpretation? Why does the sense of an earlier, more impersonal order never fully disappear? These questions surface periodically, often during times of crisis. When systems strain, archived knowledge can feel suddenly relevant again. Dormant frameworks begin to stir. The Anunnaki, in this sense, may function as a placeholder for the idea that civilization has been reset before. That what feels stable is temporary. That the rules governing the present are not universal. If so, then their disappearance is not a closed chapter. It is an unresolved tension, a reminder embedded in the structure of history that continuity is an illusion maintained by selective memory, and if civilizations can reset once, narrowing their worldview to survive, they can do so again. Each reset trimming away complexity until only the most functional narratives remain. The question then becomes whether anything essential is lost in the process, whether certain truths once archived become inaccessible not because they are false, but because the systems that could hold them no longer exist. The silence of the Anunnaki may be one such truth, not something that vanished, but something that no longer fits. And if it no longer fits, it may not be because it was wrong, but because it belonged to a version of humanity that understood itself differently, as part of a system, rather than its centre. That understanding, once set aside, leaves behind a quiet unease, a sense that something foundational has been simplified away, and that the cost of that simplification may not yet be fully paid. If the past was reset once to make the present possible, then the present may one day be reset for the same reason, and what is archived now may become the silent future generations inherit, wondering what was allowed to disappear in the name of survival. When the Anunnaki fade from the centre of Mesopotamian memory, they do not do so alone. Across distant cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, similar figures withdraw in remarkably similar ways. The pattern is not identical, but the rhythm is familiar. Gods who once shaped the world step back. They are replaced by intermediaries, heroes, moral overseers, or abstract principles. The heavens grow quieter, even as human stories grow louder. This resemblance invites comparison, not to prove a shared origin, but to observe a shared response. Civilizations confronted with complexity, collapse, or expansion often reshape their cosmologies in parallel ways. The withdrawal of supreme figures appears less like an anomaly, and more like a recurring adjustment. In early Egyptian thought, the gods walk among humans in the distant past. Later, divine presence becomes mediated through ritual and kingship. In Mesoamerican traditions, earlier ages end catastrophically, and the beings who presided over them are never fully restored. In Indo-European mythologies, primordial gods are displaced by younger generations who rule through law, contract, and hierarchy. The old powers remain, but they no longer govern openly. These stories differ in detail, but they share a structure. A remote age of direct divine administration gives way to a historical age where order is maintained through institutions, codes, and intermediaries. The gods retreat, not because they are defeated, but because the world they governed no longer exists in the same form. This suggests that the disappearance of the Anunnaki may reflect a broader civilizational strategy. When societies grow beyond certain thresholds, direct cosmic governance becomes incompatible with daily life. Too much authority from beyond undermines human systems. Too much mystery destabilizes law. In such moments, myths reorganize themselves. Figures associated with overwhelming scale are repositioned. They become ancestors, judges, or abstractions. Their stories are preserved, but their relevance is reduced. Comparative mythology shows that this repositioning often coincides with the rise of written law. Once rules are codified, authority no longer needs to descend from the sky. It can be cited, interpreted, enforced. The divine becomes a reference rather than a presence. The Anunnaki, as regulators of cosmic balance, would have posed a challenge to such systems. Their authority does not translate easily into statutes. Their judgments are not subject to appeal. To integrate them fully would be to undermine human legal structures, so they remain acknowledged but distant. Their disappearance is functional. It allows societies to claim continuity with the sacred while asserting autonomy in practice. What makes this pattern unsettling is how rarely it is discussed explicitly. No culture seems eager to announce that its gods have withdrawn. Instead, the change is narrated through metaphor, genealogy, and catastrophe. The old age ends. A new one begins. The transition is accepted but not examined. This avoidance suggests discomfort, a reluctance to confront what is lost when supreme authority is no longer external. Without such authority, societies must generate legitimacy internally. Power becomes human, fallible, negotiable. The Anunnaki, in this context, represent a model of order that does not flatter humanity. They do not center human values. They do not explain suffering in moral terms. They simply maintain balance. Across cultures, such models tend to be short-lived. They are difficult to sustain emotionally. They offer little comfort. They demand acceptance rather than interpretation. As civilizations mature, they often prefer gods who reflect human concerns, deities who love, rage, forgive, and punish in recognizable ways. These gods are easier to relate to, easier to negotiate with, easier to use as mirrors for social order. The withdrawal of figures like the Anunnaki may therefore mark a psychological shift as much as a historical one, a movement toward narratives that place humanity at the center of meaning rather than at the periphery of a vast system. This shift has advantages. It allows for ethical development, social responsibility, and a sense of agency. But it also narrows perspective. It reduces the universe to a stage for human drama. In the earlier worldview, humanity is one component among many. In the later worldview, humanity becomes the axis around which meaning turns. The disappearance of the Anunnaki aligns with this reorientation, yet comparative traditions also preserve a warning. In many myths, the withdrawal of primordial powers is followed by instability. Cycles of destruction and renewal repeat. New gods prove less capable of maintaining balance. The world becomes more fragile. This fragility is often explained as moral failure, but it may reflect something deeper. Without a framework that situates humanity within an impersonal order, societies struggle to recognize limits. Everything becomes negotiable. Expansion becomes inevitable. The Anunnaki, associated with limits, measurement, and allocation, embody a principle that resists endless growth. Their disappearance may signal the loss of that principle. If similar figures vanish across cultures during periods of expansion and consolidation, then their absence may be a precondition for empire. Empires require narratives that justify domination, progress, and centralization. Cosmic administrators who operate beyond moral narrative complicate such justifications. By stepping aside, the Anunnaki make room for gods who sanction conquest, hierarchy, and law. This does not require malice, it requires alignment. Comparative mythology thus reframes the question. Instead of asking why the Anunnaki disappeared, it asks what kind of world emerges when such figures are no longer central. The answer appears consistent: a world where history accelerates, where human institutions take precedence, where meaning is constructed rather than inherited. This world feels familiar. It is the one we live in, a world where authority is debated, not received, where truth is contextual, not structural. The cost of this familiarity is distance from scale, from deep time, from systems that operate regardless of belief. The Anunnaki may symbolize that lost relationship, a reminder that the universe was once understood as something that did not care about human narratives. If that understanding faded across cultures for similar reasons, then the disappearance of the Anunnaki is not a singular mystery. It is part of a recurring adjustment in how civilizations position themselves within reality. And if such adjustments have occurred before, they may occur again, each time reshaping memory, each time deciding which figures remain active and which retreat into silence. The comparative lens does not resolve the mystery. It deepens it. It suggests that the silence surrounding the Anunnaki is not accidental but patterned, not unique but familiar, and familiarity in this case is unsettling. It implies that what vanished once may vanish again, that the structures we rely on are temporary, that our narratives of order are contingent. The Anunnaki, viewed from this distance, become less like lost gods and more like markers, indicators of a boundary humanity repeatedly crosses when it chooses intimacy over scale, control over comprehension. What remains uncertain is whether that boundary can be crossed indefinitely without consequence, and whether the figures left behind in silence represent something we will one day need to remember again, when the systems we trust begin to strain under their own weight. As centuries pass, the memory of the Anunnaki does not vanish suddenly. It thins. It becomes less dangerous, less demanding, easier to carry without consequence. And in that thinning, a new force quietly takes their place. Not a god, but a system. A way of deciding what is worth remembering and what is allowed to fade. Empires do not merely conquer land. They standardize memory. They gather fragments of the past and arrange them into narratives that can be governed. What cannot be governed must be simplified, reframed, or removed from active circulation. The Anunnaki, by their very nature, resist standardization. They belong to a worldview that does not privilege any single city, dynasty, or lineage. Their authority is systemic, not territorial. As Mesopotamia falls under successive empires, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, the need for a coherent, centralized history intensifies. Diverse local traditions are harmonized. Contradictions are smoothed. Myths are edited to align with political reality. This process is rarely explicit. It operates through emphasis, omission, and reinterpretation. In such an environment, figures like the Anunnaki become problematic. They're too old to be claimed by any one regime, too abstract to legitimize specific rulers, too impersonal to be mobilized for loyalty. They offer no clear endorsement of empire. What empires require instead are gods who can be localized, gods who choose favorites, gods who sanction conquest, law, and hierarchy. These gods can be named in inscriptions. They can be invoked before battle. They can be thanked for victory. Their narratives are adaptable. The Anunnaki offer none of this. They do not fight wars. They do not crown conquerors. They do not speak in slogans. Their silence is structural, not strategic, and that silence makes them unusable. As imperial archives grow, so does the distinction between official knowledge and peripheral tradition. Certain texts are copied frequently, others less so. Over time, frequency becomes authority. What is copied survives. What is not becomes obscure. This is not censorship in the modern sense. It is prioritization. Scribes are trained to reproduce what is considered essential. Their education reflects institutional values. If the Anunnaki no longer serve those values, they naturally recede. There is evidence of this process in the way later commentaries treat earlier myths. Complex cosmologies are summarized. Ambiguous figures are explained away. The unknown is rendered symbolic. This is not malicious. It is pedagogical. When knowledge becomes difficult to teach, it becomes dangerous to preserve. Not because it is false, but because it destabilizes consensus. Empires depend on consensus. The result is a canonized past, a version of history that feels complete, even if it is selective. Gaps are acknowledged, but not explored. Questions are deferred indefinitely. The Anunnaki fall into one of these gaps, known but not pursued, mentioned but not investigated. Their disappearance becomes normalized through repetition. Religious institutions play a crucial role in this normalization. As temples become centers of learning and administration, theology aligns with governance. Gods are interpreted in ways that support order. Rituals are standardized. Orthodoxy emerges. Within orthodoxy, ambiguity is tolerated only when it can be contained. The Anunnaki, associated with pre-orthodox cosmology, become increasingly marginal. They do not fit neatly into sanctioned frameworks of belief. Over time, belief itself changes. It becomes less about participating in cosmic order and more about adhering to prescribed practice. Correctness replaces comprehension. Faith becomes procedural. In such a system, there is little room for entities that operate beyond procedure. The Anunnaki are not invoked in daily worship. They do not respond to offerings. They do not reward compliance. They simply exist, indifferent. Indifference is difficult to institutionalize. It cannot be regulated. It cannot be enforced. It undermines the logic of reward and punishment that sustains social order. So indifference is reinterpreted. It becomes distance. Distance becomes abstraction. Abstraction becomes irrelevance. This process does not erase the Anunnaki. It transforms them into something safe, something that can be acknowledged without consequence. A historical curiosity, a mythological footnote, but safety has a cost. When knowledge is made safe, it is also made inert. Its capacity to challenge assumptions is neutralized. The silence surrounding the Anunnaki thus reflects not ignorance, but management. A decision repeated across generations to preserve stability at the expense of depth. This decision is rarely conscious. It emerges from institutional momentum. Once a narrative becomes dominant, deviation requires effort. Silence becomes the path of least resistance. By the time later scholars encounter the Anunnaki, they inherit this silence as fact. The absence feels natural. The question of disappearance seems misplaced. Gods fade. Myths evolve. This is how history works, and yet the pattern remains unsettling. Because it suggests that history is not only shaped by what happens, but by what is allowed to matter. If institutions can guide memory so effectively, then disappearance is not always the result of loss. Sometimes it is the result of alignment. Knowledge that does not align simply drifts out of focus. The Anunnaki, then, may represent a kind of unaligned knowledge, a worldview that does not serve empire, orthodoxy, or moral narrative, a way of understanding reality that resists domestication. Their disappearance marks the triumph of manageable meaning over expansive structure, of stories that can be governed over systems that cannot. What remains unresolved is whether such a triumph is sustainable. Empires fall, institutions dissolve, orthodoxy fractures. When that happens, archived knowledge can resurface, not as relic, but as provocation. The silence around the Anunnaki may thus be temporary on a civilizational scale, not an end, but a pause, a compression of memory that holds until conditions change. And if those conditions change again through collapse, disruption, or exhaustion, then what was once unmanageable may become necessary. The very frameworks that were set aside may return as tools for understanding a world that no longer fits the simplified narratives we inherited. The disappearance of the Anunnaki, viewed through the lens of institutional memory, is not a mystery solved. It is a process still unfolding, a reminder that what we call history is often a negotiation between truth and usability, and if that negotiation continues, then the silence we now accept may one day feel as artificial as the gaps we now question. Every so often something emerges from the ground that does not quite fit, a layer where it should not be, a tool whose precision feels premature, a pattern that refuses to align neatly with the timeline drawn above it. These moments are not rare in archaeology. What is rare is what happens next. Most anomalies do not ignite revolutions. They are catalogued, debated briefly, and then absorbed into footnotes. Their edges are softened, their implications narrowed. Over time, they lose their capacity to disturb. In the context of Mesopotamia, such anomalies tend to cluster around periods already marked by transition, layers between eras, strata associated with abandonment, rebuilding, or sudden cultural shifts, the very places where continuity feels weakest. Some discoveries suggest technical knowledge that appears fully formed rather than gradually developed. Others hint at administrative complexity emerging faster than expected. Still others imply astronomical awareness that seems disproportionate to the tools assumed to be available. None of these findings prove anything on their own. Archaeology rarely does. Evidence accumulates slowly and interpretation is cautious by necessity. But taken together, these anomalies form a pattern of discomfort. he sensed that the narrative of a linear progression is being quietly strained. What makes this discomfort particularly relevant to the disappearance of the Anunnaki is not what these discoveries claim, but how they are handled. The dominant response is not rejection, but containment. Alternative explanations are offered quickly, contexts are redefined, margins are tightened. This is not deception, it is method. Academic disciplines survive by maintaining coherence. When coherence is threatened, explanation becomes defensive, yet defensiveness reveals pressure. It signals that something is being protected, not from falsehood, but from complexity. The Anunnaki belong to this same zone of complexity. They are not easily reducible to metaphor. They resist tidy classification as purely symbolic or purely mythic. Their functions overlap with administration, measurement, and regulation in ways that feel uncomfortably concrete. So when material evidence surfaces that echoes these functions, unexpected standardization, advanced record keeping, architectural precision, it quietly amplifies the unease. It suggests that the worldview encoded in early texts may have been more operational than later generations were comfortable acknowledging. Some scholars propose that these anomalies reflect lost local traditions, independent innovations, or gaps in our understanding of gradual development. These explanations are plausible. They may even be correct, but they also serve another function. They preserve the assumption that nothing fundamental is missing. What if something is missing? Not a device, not a technology, but a framework, a way of organizing reality that once allowed certain kinds of knowledge to exist coherently and that later collapsed. If such a framework existed, then fragments of it might surface as anomalies when removed from their original context, like tools without instructions. Patterns without language. The Anunnaki may represent the conceptual spine of such a framework, not as beings to be believed in literally, but as placeholders for a system of order that does not survive translation into later paradigms. When that system dissolved, its artifacts would not vanish. They would become inexplicable. This would explain why certain discoveries feel both impressive and dislocated. They are remnants of a logic no longer in use. In this light, the marginalization of such findings is not suppression, but symptom. A civilization cannot easily integrate evidence that implies a different foundation than the one it relies upon. There is also the matter of scale. Modern interpretation tends to favor incremental change. It is comfortable with slow evolution, uncomfortable with abrupt reconfiguration. But resets leave traces that do not conform to gradualism. They create sharp edges in the record. The flood narratives already acknowledge such an edge. A before and after that resists smoothing. Archaeological anomalies may be the material counterpart to that narrative boundary. If the Anunnaki are bound to the before, then evidence that gestures toward their world will always feel out of place in the after. It will be treated as noise. Over time, this noise accumulates. It does not overturn the dominant narrative, but it hums beneath it. A low-frequency disturbance that attentive listeners can sense, even if they cannot articulate it. This hum is not proof, it is pressure. Pressure builds where explanations are strained, where too many exceptions must be managed, where certainty becomes procedural rather than earned. The disappearance of the Anunnaki may thus be mirrored in the disappearance of interpretive openness. As frameworks narrow, so does the range of acceptable questions. Certain lines of inquiry become unfashionable, not forbidden, just unrewarded. Curiosity redirects itself towards safer terrain. And yet, curiosity has a way of returning, often at the edges, often during periods of instability when established systems no longer suffice. It is during such periods that archived anomalies regain significance. What once felt irrelevant begins to feel suggestive. Patterns once dismissed begin to align. This does not mean that the Anunnaki return as answers. They return as questions, as prompts that destabilize certainty. The danger, from an institutional perspective, is not that such questions are wrong, but that they cannot be easily contained. They reopen debates about origins, authority, and continuity. So the silence persists, not enforced, but maintained. But silence is not absence, it is a condition. And conditions can change. If future discoveries continue to complicate the record, if anomalies accumulate faster than they can be contextualized, then the pressure will increase. At some point, the framework may need to expand again. If that happens, figures like the Anunnaki may re-enter discourse, not as gods to be worshipped, but as conceptual tools, as symbols of a different way of organizing knowledge. Their disappearance, then, would not mark failure or fiction, but incompatibility, a mismatch between frameworks. What matters is not whether they were real in a literal sense, but whether the worldview they represent once functioned, and whether its absence has consequences we are still negotiating. The Earth has a way of remembering what societies try to forget. It preserves layers indiscriminately. It does not care which stories are convenient. When it reveals something out of sequence, it does not explain itself. It simply presents the problem. The problem in this case may not be that ancient people believed in gods who vanished. It may be that they operated within a structure of understanding that later generations chose not to inherit. If so, then the disappearance of the Anunnaki is not a mythological puzzle. It is an epistemological one. A question not about what happened, but about what kind of knowledge a civilization is willing to carry forward and what kind it quietly leaves behind. And if that choice has been made before, under pressure and uncertainty, it may be made again, each time shaping the past into something survivable, but incomplete. What remains in the gaps is not error, but possibility. And possibility, once buried, has a way of resurfacing when the ground shifts again. As the centuries deepen, the Anunnaki begin to change shape, not in stone or text, but in perception. What once functioned as a framework of order becomes a story. What once governed becomes symbol. This transformation is not sudden. It unfolds through reinterpretation, through the quiet alchemy by which lived structures become metaphors. Symbolization is often mistaken for preservation. To say that something lives on as a symbol sounds like survival. But symbols are lighter than systems. They carry meaning without obligation. They invite contemplation without consequence. In becoming symbolic, the Anunnaki become safe. In later traditions, their names are invoked less to explain how the world works and more to gesture toward depth. They signal antiquity, authority, mystery. But they no longer demand engagement. They do not require the listener to reorganize reality. This shift is visible in how stories are told. Earlier texts assume a shared understanding of cosmic order. Later retellings explain more, justify more, moralize more. The Anunnaki are framed as embodiments of abstract forces rather than participants in administration. Their actions are allegorized. Their decisions become lessons. Allegory is a powerful tool. It allows complex ideas to survive translation, but it also strips away specificity. The difference between an allegory of balance and a system that enforces balance is profound. One instructs, the other constrains. As allegories, the Anunnaki can be admired without being reckoned with. They can be discussed without altering behavior. Their presence enriches narrative texture, but no longer structures thought. This is where disappearance becomes difficult to detect. Nothing is removed. Everything remains. Names persist. Stories circulate. Yet something essential is gone. The requirement to align with a non-human order. When the Anunnaki become symbols, the universe becomes expressive rather than operative. Meaning flows from interpretation rather than structure. Reality becomes something that can be narrated in multiple ways without losing coherence. This plurality feels liberating. It allows cultures to adapt, to absorb new influences, to reinterpret old material. But it also introduces a subtle instability. Without a shared structural reference, meaning becomes negotiable. Negotiation favours those with interpretive authority, those who tell the stories, those who define symbols. Power shifts from the cosmos to the narrator. The Anunnaki, once indifferent to narrative framing, are now entirely dependent on it. Their significance rises and falls with interpretation. They no longer impose, they are imposed upon. This transformation aligns with broader philosophical changes. As human-centered ethics develop, the universe is increasingly understood through intention and value rather than necessity. Events are explained in terms of purpose, not position. In such a world-view, a God who regulates without intention feels alien. The Anunnaki do not love or hate humanity in simple terms. They do not reward virtue or punish vice. They maintain equilibrium. Equilibrium without moral narrative is difficult to symbolize. It resists anthropomorphism. It does not translate easily into story. So the Anunnaki are recast. They become judges of the dead, or guardians of thresholds, or embodiments of primordial forces. Each role is smaller than the original, more contained. Containment is the key. By confining the Anunnaki to symbolic roles, cultures preserve their memory without risking disruption. The past is honoured, but neutralized. This neutralization has consequences. When deep structures are replaced by symbols, explanation becomes aesthetic, coherence becomes optional. Contradictions are tolerated because nothing is operational. The result is a layered mythology where depth is suggested rather than enacted. Mystery becomes a feature, not a problem to be solved. For listeners and readers, this can be satisfying. It invites contemplation without demand. It offers the comfort of ancient wisdom without the burden of alignment. But for the system itself, something is lost. The ability to situate humanity within an impersonal order fades. Limits become negotiable. Growth becomes unbounded. The Anunnaki, in their original function, imply constraints that do not bend to narrative preference. Their disappearance as systems marks the removal of those constraints from active consideration. What replaces them are stories that center human experience. Suffering is explained through morality, success through merit or favor. The cosmos becomes responsive to human meaning. This responsiveness feels intimate. It brings the universe closer, but it also narrows it. In a symbolic cosmos, scale collapses. Deep time becomes backdrop. Vast cycles become metaphors for inner states. The universe reflects humanity, rather than containing it. The Anunnaki, reduced to symbols, mirror this collapse. They no longer represent an order beyond us. They represent ideas within us. This inward turn may be inevitable. As societies grow more complex, they require narratives that can integrate diversity of belief. Symbols are flexible, systems are not. Yet flexibility comes at a cost. When everything can be reinterpreted, nothing anchors meaning. Stability depends on consensus rather than structure. Consensus is fragile. It must be maintained. It can be manipulated. The disappearance of the Anunnaki as operative forces may thus mark the beginning of a long reliance on narrative cohesion rather than structural alignment. This reliance works until it doesn't, until narratives fracture, until consensus fails. At those moments, symbols feel insufficient. People search for frameworks that do more than inspire. They look for structures that explain why things happen regardless of belief. It is often during such periods that interest in ancient systems resurfaces, not out of nostalgia but necessity. The past is revisited not as story, but as repository. The Anunnaki, lingering as symbols, become candidates for re-evaluation. What if they were not metaphors? What if they encoded a way of thinking about order that we have lost? Such questions do not restore the past, they destabilize the present, and that may be why symbolization persists. It allows curiosity without consequence, wonder without demand. The Anunnaki, transformed into symbols, invite fascination while remaining harmless. They no longer challenge the foundations of reality, they decorate them. But decoration can only go so far. When systems strain, symbols crack. The disappearance of the Anunnaki seen through this lens is not a vanishing act. It is a metamorphosis, a reduction from framework to figure, from necessity to narrative. What remains uncertain is whether that reduction is permanent, whether symbols can ever be reassembled into systems, whether memory can reverse its own compression. If the Anunnaki once represented an order that did not depend on belief, then their symbolic afterlife may be only a pause, a holding pattern. Waiting for a time when the universe once again feels too large, too indifferent, too structured to be explained through story alone. And when that time comes, the symbols may begin to feel heavy again, demanding, insufficient in their current form. At that point, the question will no longer be why the Anunnaki disappeared, but why they were reduced, and what it would mean to encounter them not as stories, but as the shadow of a structure we no longer know how to inhabit. If the Anunnaki did not vanish, but withdrew into symbol, archive and abstraction, then a more unsettling possibility emerges. Withdrawal implies intention, not necessarily choice in the human sense, but a movement away from visibility, a transition from presence to oversight, from governance to observation. In several late Mesopotamian traditions, hints of this shift remain, not as doctrine, but as unease. The gods are still said to see everything, judgment still occurs, fate is still weighed, but the mechanisms are distant, deferred, inaccessible. Accountability moves inward, while surveillance remains cosmic. This asymmetry is important. A world where higher forces observe but do not intervene creates a different psychological landscape than one where they rule directly. Responsibility becomes total. Explanation becomes scarce. The Anunnaki, increasingly associated with judgment rather than action, occupy this silent position. They are no longer builders of order, but witnesses to its outcome. They do not shape events, they evaluate them. This repositioning preserves authority while removing obligation. It allows the cosmos to remain structured without requiring active management. Order persists, but it no longer speaks. Such a configuration would resolve many tensions. It removes the problem of divine failure during catastrophe. It explains silence without denying existence. It transforms disappearance into distance. Distance, unlike absence, can be permanent. In this model, the Anunnaki do not leave the world. They step behind it. They cease to participate in time as humans experience it. Their domain becomes the interval between cause and consequence, between life and death, between action and accounting. This interpretation aligns with their later associations with the underworld and judgment, not as rulers of darkness, but as custodians of thresholds. They preside not over what happens, but over what it means. Meaning without intervention is a heavy burden to place on humanity. It implies that the universe is structured, but indifferent. That balance exists, but must be maintained without assistance. That failure is recorded, but not corrected. Such a worldview is austere. It offers no rescue, no appeal, only alignment or consequence. It is also psychologically demanding. Most societies soften it over time. They introduce mediators, they personalize forces, they create avenues for negotiation. The disappearance of the Anunnaki from daily life may reflect this softening, a retreat from a worldview that places too much weight on human action without comfort. But the structure may remain intact beneath the softening, like a foundation covered by newer flaws. If so, then the silence surrounding the Anunnaki is not forgetfulness, but respect, or fear, or both. There is precedent for this kind of withdrawal in philosophical traditions. In some systems, the highest principles do not act. They ground reality by existing, not by intervening. Action belongs to lower levels. Change happens within constraints that never announce themselves. The Anunnaki, reframed in this way, resemble principles rather than personalities. Their names become handles for something that cannot be addressed directly. This would explain why later traditions struggle to speak about them clearly. Language is better suited to agents than to structures. When agency recedes, metaphor takes over. It would also explain why their disappearance feels incomplete, why they are never fully denied, why they linger in liminal spaces, between eras, between worlds, between meanings. If the Anunnaki became guardians of structure rather than participants in narrative, then asking where they went misses the point. They did not go anywhere. They became inaccessible by design. Inaccessible structures are stable. They do not invite negotiation. They do not respond to crisis. They simply hold. From this perspective, the repeated resets of civilization take on a different tone. They are not failures of governance. They are corrections, adjustments that restore balance without explanation. Humanity experiences them as catastrophe. The system experiences them as recalibration. This interpretation is unsettling because it removes comfort. It suggests that meaning does not protect, that knowledge does not guarantee survival, that alignment matters more than belief. It also challenges the assumption that disappearance implies absence. What if the Anunnaki are most present precisely when they are least visible? When events unfold according to constraints that no one claims responsibility for? Such a presence would not announce itself. It would not leave messages. It would not require worship. It would simply operate. The silence of the Anunnaki may therefore be the silence of something that does not speak, because it does not need to. A silence that is not empty, but complete. If this is the case, then the gradual removal of their stories from active circulation may have been less an act of erasure and more an act of mercy. A way to allow human societies to function without constant awareness of impersonal judgment. Yet mercy has limits. Systems that are ignored do not disappear. They assert themselves eventually, often through consequences that feel sudden because their causes were invisible. The Anunnaki, as silent custodians, would not warn, they would not explain, they would only be felt when balance tipped too far. This possibility reframes the entire arc of disappearance. What fades from story may remain in effect. What withdraws from ritual may still define boundaries. The question then becomes not whether the Anunnaki are gone, but whether humanity has learned to live without acknowledging them. And if that is so, then the persistent sense of instability that haunts civilizations, the feeling that order is provisional, that resets are always possible, may not be anxiety at all. It may be perception, a perception of structure without voice, of oversight without guidance, of a system that does not adapt to human preference. If such a system exists, it does not care whether it is named. It does not require belief. It operates regardless. The Anunnaki, reduced to silence, may be the last remaining sign that ancient cultures once acknowledged this reality openly, before deciding that it was too heavy to carry into daily life. Their disappearance would then mark not the end of an era, but a boundary of awareness, a point beyond which knowledge becomes too consequential to be lived with continuously. And if that boundary was crossed once, intentionally or not, it may be crossed again. Each time narrowing what can be spoken, widening what must be endured. The silence left behind is not a void. It is a space where explanation ends and consequence begins. Whether that space was created to protect humanity or to manage it remains unresolved. The tablets do not say. The myths do not clarify. The ground does not answer. What remains is the sense that something once stood closer, spoke louder, and then chose, or was required, to step back. And if that step back was not a disappearance, but a repositioning, then the most important question may still be ahead. Not where the Anunnaki went, but what kind of world requires its deeper structures to remain silent in order to continue at all. At the end of this long narrowing, there is no revelation waiting, no final tablet uncovered, no voice returning to explain what was lost. There is only silence, structured, deliberate, and strangely persistent. The disappearance of the Anunnaki does not resolve itself into a single cause. It does not collapse neatly into catastrophe, invention, or forgetting. Instead, it stretches across time as a process, a slow withdrawal woven into language, ritual, memory, and governance. What remains is not an absence, but a contour, the outline of something that once shaped reality, and then stepped beyond articulation. History, as it is usually told, prefers conclusions. It favours endings that reassure. Gods die, myths evolve. Myths, knowledge improves, but the Anunnaki resist this arc. They do not end, they recede, and recession leaves pressure. Pressure is felt where explanation no longer satisfies, where systems work, but feel incomplete, where order persists, but meaning feels provisional. This is the legacy of a silence that was not accidental. If the Anunnaki once represented an understanding of the world as governed by impersonal structure rather than intention, then their disappearance marks a turning point, a moment when humanity chose narratives that could be lived with daily over truths that were too heavy to remain present. That choice made civilization possible as we recognize it. Law over inevitability, ethics over balance, interpretation over alignment. These are not failures, they are adaptations, but adaptations always trade depth for survivability. What was traded away may not have been belief in gods, but tolerance for scale, for deep time, for systems that do not care whether they are understood. The Anunnaki, in this sense, are less about divinity than about proportion. They remind us of a universe that does not bend to story. Their silence now functions like a horizon, a limit beyond which explanation dissolves. We can approach it, we can gesture toward it, but we cannot cross it without destabilizing the frameworks that allow daily life to proceed. That may be why the silence persists across cultures, across epochs, why similar figures withdraw elsewhere, why supreme structures are consistently replaced by negotiable ones. Civilizations do not erase what they fear, they distance it. Distance creates manageability, yet distance does not eliminate influence. It only delays recognition. When systems strain, when laws multiply but fail, when narratives fracture, when meaning becomes unstable, the sense of something missing grows stronger. Not as memory, but as pressure, as the feeling that explanations have become too small. At such moments the past is often revisited, not for comfort but for scale, for reminders that the present is not the measure of all things. The Anunnaki, preserved in fragments and symbols, occupy this role. They are not answers, they are indicators, signs that another way of structuring reality once existed, and that it was deliberately set aside. Whether that way was truer, harsher, or simply different remains unknowable. The silence does not explain itself, but silence has weight. It presses on the edges of thought, it shapes questions by refusing to answer them. It teaches restraint. Perhaps this is the final function of the Anunnaki, not as rulers, not as judges, but as reminders of limit, of the boundary between what can be organized into story and what must remain structural. If so, then their disappearance is not a loss to be corrected. It is a condition to be understood. A condition that asks not what we believe, but what we can carry. The ancient tablets do not close this question. They leave it suspended, names without verbs, structures without explanation, a cosmos that once spoke and then chose not to. In that quiet, something remains unresolved. A tension between human meaning and impersonal order, between narrative comfort and structural truth. That tension has not gone away. It has only been buried under layers of interpretation, law, and symbol. And like all buried things, it waits, not to return unchanged, but to be encountered differently when the ground shifts again. The Anunnaki do not need to come back. Their silence already does its work. It reminds us that history is not only what is remembered, but what is set beyond reach. That civilization is built not just on knowledge, but on what it decides it can no longer afford to know. And as the night grows quieter, as thought loosens its grip, that realization lingers, not as fear, but as scale. A sense that the world is larger than the stories we tell about it, and that some truths, once withdrawn, do not disappear. They simply wait in the silence for the moment when listening becomes necessary again.